Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. You're at Decolonizing Ethnobotany, which is being put on by the Society for Economic Botany, and I'm Dr. John Delaparra. So I want to just warmly welcome everyone that's here, and there's been a few more people that have trickled in since I made this announcement, but if you'd like, please put some information in the chat about who you are, where you come from, what brings you to today's discussion. So I'll first just briefly introduce myself and maybe just first say a little bit about what brings us all here today. The idea for today's discussion, which we think is very important and timely, actually first came from Dr. Sonia Peter, who is the incoming president for the Society for Economic Botany. And we were thinking about how we could have impactful presentations, panel discussions, and other events that were online that would be inclusive of our community and help bring us together, especially at this time where we think this in particular topic is so important. As part of that, we thought we would bring together a diverse audience that has perspectives about Indigenous knowledge in particular from all over the world. And what we will impress upon you as our panelists, especially Dr. John Rashford has said, and I think it's very wise, that this is a sharing of ideas and experiences. What you'll hear today is about opening up a subject for discussion so that we can all hear each other and understand more through an historical lens, through an Indigenous lens, and through many other lenses that will be exposed to through today's panel discussion, and hopefully through the future as this topic gets more and more attention than it even already has. So the speakers we have today represent a platform for discussion. They weren't pre-arranged in any way to deliver one unified message. And we imagine there'll be many perspectives, and we want them to be in dialogue with each other. And we also invite you all to join that dialogue and be a part of this as we talk about this. And as you may have seen in the agenda, I believe that at the very beginning of the chat, if you scroll up, you'll see the agenda for today's event. I'm going to do that myself just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm giving a brief introduction now, and then we'll have each of our speakers give their own introduction about their perspective, where they come from, and how they think about this topic of decolonizing ethnobotany, which we expect may be quite diverse. We'll then have a moderated panel discussion in about 1 hour where we have several questions that have been generated through the panelists themselves, through members of the society, and has been edited and trimmed through time. 35 minutes is not a very long time for this, but we will have some of those questions directed to individual speakers. And then we'll open up this discussion to everyone here in the room. And you can submit your questions, and I'll remind you of this, either through the chat, or you can raise your hand on, through the Zoom function, and then I'll unmute you, and you can ask your question directly to whoever you want to direct it to. And then at the end, we're having a little experiment, which is our virtual coffee break. This came, I think it was through Trish Flaster, actually said we really need more interaction amongst our members, and the people that attend these events would love to be able to talk to each other, maybe have more time with individual panelists. And it's another one of Trish's wonderful ideas. So we're giving it a try. We're going to try it today, and it's something that we may do in the future in our other events if it turns out well. And I'll explain more when we get to the breakout room how that will work. But what I will say now is hopefully at the bottom of your screen, you will see an option for breakout rooms. You don't do anything with that at the moment. But if you don't see that, you may need to upgrade to the latest version of Zoom. So I'm giving you a little bit of time if you have to do that before we get to that point. But only with some of the later versions of Zoom are you able to join these breakout rooms. The update has been out for several months, so it's likely that everyone already has this update, but we just wanted to point that out. And at that time, you'll be able to choose a breakout room and have a more intimate discussion with any of the panel members and maybe with each other. Okay. So now I'll just introduce myself briefly. As I said, I'm Dr. John Delaparra. I'm a researcher at Harvard University, a lecturer at Tufts University. And my work has focused on how Indigenous people utilize plants for both food and medicine. Because of that work, in the past year, I've taken on the role as manager of the global food portfolio at the Rockefeller Foundation, where I work on a number of projects, including the upcoming United Nations Food Systems Summit, which I encourage you all to look into. There's there's a lot of debate around this, and we're really trying to make this much more inclusive than these events have been in the past. So I'm gonna put a link in the chat for something that the Rockefeller Foundation has funded and is looking to help bring Indigenous voices and voices from around the world to participate in the Food Systems Summit. There's something we're calling the Food Systems Game Changers Lab. So I'm gonna put that in the chat. Oh, I think I actually sent that to just one person. Let me send it to everyone. Sorry, Eve, I sent it to you. Okay, there. So if you'd like, it's something you can look into. We're looking for. Okay, so we're now recording, just so everyone knows. If make sure you're okay with that. If you'd like, you can of course turn off your video and mute yourself. In fact, we'd like everyone to make sure that they remain muted throughout the panel discussion. I mentioned we will take questions at the end via chat or via raised hand, and I'll remind you of that again. And I already discussed the virtual coffee break. Okay, so I think I have touched on all the logistical points and gone over my own time. So we're going to turn to our first panelist, who I'll give a brief introduction to, and then they will speak further about their own background. Let me just pull up the agenda. Okay, so our first invitee, who, and as I mentioned, in this first portion, each speaker will give about a 15-minute background and talk about their work, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So Dr. Wendy Makoons Geniusz is Associate Professor of Ojibwe Language at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Dr. Geniusz is a Cree and Métis woman whose research focuses on Ojibwe language and botanical knowledge. Anyone can watch her Ojibwe language classes at uwec.ly/Ojibwe, and I'll put that link in the chat as well. And today she'll present a short talk entitled Biskaabiiyang, Why We Talk About Decolonizing in Ojibwe, We Say We Are Turning to Ourselves. Dr. Geniusz.
How? Bonjour and Dinue Maganaduk. Anishinaabe Indao, Makwan Dode, Minuaki Bonjaba, Makoons Indigenous cause, An Dinue Maganug, Ema Jaganashia King, Onjabawa, Gema Opas Kwayat, An Dash Agama King, Onjabawa, Jigwa Dash Inga Jaganashim Bangi, Apajigomi Great Bizindawi Egg. It's in accordance with Anishinaabe Ojibwe protocols that I introduce myself to you this way today. It's really important in our culture that people know where we're from, so that and who we're related to, so that they'll know where our teachings come from. And I told you that I have family that comes from Opaskwaiyat, which is also called the Paw in Manitoba. I also have relatives that come from Europe. I have European ancestry. I was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the short version of my Ojibwe name is Makoons. I actually have biologically Cree and Métis background, but I was raised with Ojibwe language and culture. And if you need my link for the Ojibwe classes, it's here too. Aha. This was my Ojibwe namesake, Kiwe Nokwe Peshel, and this is was my mother, Mary Sisip Geniusz, and these two women were my first teachers of Anishinaabe Gikendasawin, or Anishinaabe Ojibwe knowledge, and they're the first people who taught me about our culture and working with our elder brothers and sisters, the plants and the trees. I put my timer on, I forgot, hang on. So Biskaabiiyang approach to research, this isn't something that I developed on my own. A program, the Masters of Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy at the Seven Generations Education Institute, they worked with elders to develop this research methodology. They told me to describe them this way. They're nestled between Couchiching First Nation Reserve and Fort Francis, Ontario. In the States, you're basically looking at Minnesota and that tip that goes up into Canada, they're across from there. So when we talk about decolonization in Ojibwe language, we use the word Biskaabiiyang, which literally means when we return to ourselves, or when we make a round trip, when we return to our teachings. And the research methodology here, and I think that the original methodologies were developed for Anishinaabe people doing research that would be meaningful to themselves and their own communities and their families. But I believe in my years teaching this approach to predominantly non-Native students, I believe that this is an approach that everyone that wants to work on decolonization of any research topic really, really needs to do, to actually create meaningful research data that's going to be mutually beneficial to communities, ourselves, and all the other beings on our planet. Basically, what these methodologies tell us to do is to try to examine ourselves and our own thoughts, and to really start to see, what do I believe about this topic? So when we're looking at plants and trees, what do I believe about them? What do I believe about my ancestors' teachings about them? Or if you're not part of that community, what do I believe about Indigenous teachings about plants and trees and knowledge about those things? And you want to look at it and what are your thoughts on it? And you want to divide out the stereotypes you might have, the things you might have encountered from all the negative forces of colonization. And you want to know, this way of thinking about Indigenous knowledge, is it primitive? Is it less than, is it somehow less than non-Native science knowledge about botanical beings? You need to separate that out and say, I know that these thoughts are in my head, or I know I've heard these things, but I know that this is a real negative way of looking at this knowledge and these teachings and these plants and trees, and I'm going to ignore that and continue my research from that way. And as Anishinaabe people, we're also encouraging our community members who are doing, ethnobotanical research or working with plants and trees to really think about, who gave you teachings about these? Where can you start to learn more about our culture and these plants and trees and the way that our ancestors have looked at them? And that's what this returning to the self means. And in our language, to talk about someone who's colonized, we say Jaganashi ya dize, which means he or she is living a white person's life or a non-Native life, and they're doing that at the expense of being Anishinaabe. So for us, decolonization or Biskaabiiyang, it's really intricately tied to healing, self-healing, coming out of internalized oppression, ceremony, food sovereignty, coming back to what our ancestors ate, being able to have access to food and have access to healthy choices, and being able to grow our food, grow our ancestors' food, and undoing the internal effects of colonization, undoing this colonization in our brain, these stereotypes, trying to ignore those and trying to approach this research from an open perspective, respectful of our ancestors, respectful of the elders that we're working with. It's also undoing external effects of colonization, land reclamation, being able to work with the plants and trees in the area we're trying to gather different materials, for example, being able to prune and weed and transplant, and being able to have some impact on that environment. And also, including reseeding of our elder brothers and sisters, the plants and trees, being able to take environments and reclaim them. Another part of decolonization for us is living Minobima. There's many different ways that people talk about this in English. Basically, it's living a good life, living in a good way, so that you're not hurting yourself, you're not hurting other beings. And this is a quote that one of the women I showed you a picture at the beginning, my namesake, Kiwe Nokwe, this is how she described Minobima. She said, "So live each of you, that you honor those that walked here before you, so that you honor those who walk beside you, so that you are remembered with honors by those who walk here after you." And in our teachings, these other beings that we're talking about are not just humans, not just our ancestors, but also plants and trees and animals. These are all considered other forms of life in our culture, and they're beings that were created here before we were. And we're supposed to try to live in a way that doesn't destroy their ecosystems and doesn't destroy their environments. So when we're going through the questions on the panel, I'm sure this will come up more, but I'm also hoping that you're seeing there's so many different ways that ethnobotanists and botanists and biologists from all different walks of life can join our efforts in these communities and join decolonizing efforts, and also, help us deal with knowledge that we haven't necessarily worked with in a long time. There's botanical knowledge that we haven't had access to the resources to practice in a long time, and there may be warnings about those materials, for example, that we no longer have in our cultures. There also may be things that we can, have a mutual reciprocal relationship where we're sharing ideas. So I'm going to leave it there. I think we'll have some really great discussions on the panel and a lot more to share. Miigwech bizindawiyeg.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geniusz. And I hope you didn't have to cut your talk too short because I went over. So if you had any more to say, you're welcome to have a minute or two. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention before, if you'd like to change your view in the upper right-hand corner to speaker view, you'll only see the person who's speaking so that you won't see this grid of all the different faces. It's up to you how you'd like to do it, but I'm just letting everyone know that you have the option to change that view. Great. Okay, now we'll turn to Dr. John Rashford, who I'll introduce briefly. So Dr. Rashford is Professor Emeritus Anthropology at the College of Charleston. Dr. Rashford received his PhD in anthropology from the City University of New York. Dr. Rashford, I'm in New York City today, so I'm in your old stomping grounds. He has been particularly interested in the ethnobotany of the Caribbean, viewed in the context of making our present world system. He will present a short talk entitled Globalization and Decolonizing Ethnobotany. Dr. Rashford.
Well, hello everyone, and wherever you happen to be and whatever time it is for you, greetings from Charleston, South Carolina. I must say that the topic of decolonizing not just ethnobotany, but the ethnobiological sciences caught me off guard. And my initial response was not, I get it, but I'm afraid I was a bit perplexed. And I remember communicating with some of my colleagues why I was perplexed about it. Coming from the Caribbean, I often think of ethnobotany and the ethnobiological sciences as a foundation for the making of our modern world. It was plants, after all, that led to the great expansion of the West, the development and the cultivation of spice and sugar and chocolate that so transformed the lives of Europeans and spread potatoes to Europe and corn and cassava to the rest of the world and so on. That's the world that I grew up in. I'm very, very thankful that I was able to grow up in the Caribbean because that was my first impression, how extraordinary it is to have access to all of these plants assembled from around the world. Both of the yards, the gardens in which I grew up in as a young man, had breadfruit trees in them. So you can imagine how interesting it was afterwards to learn about the story of the bringing of the breadfruit to the Caribbean, and to know that, in fact, that occasion had been made urgent by the American Revolution that so damaged the trade network that supplied food to people in the Caribbean, and that people actually starved in the Caribbean because of that. When it came time for me to go to college, my family background is Quaker. And I went to and I should add, it's not by chance, after the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean in 1838, I'm talking in the British colonies, The Quakers came to Jamaica to work with indentured East Indians, and they came to the part of Jamaica that I'm from. And that's how the connection began in my family. But I mention it because for college, I went to a Quaker college. Now, I know many of my ethnobotany, ethnobiology colleagues will be surprised because I don't often talk about this. But I think this occasion provides a good justification for me sharing it with you. The Quakers started a college called Friendsworth College. The idea behind it is very simple. Every 6 to 9 months, you study in a different part of the world. And people in each part of the world would start in their own region. And by the time you graduate, you'd have gone around the world one complete time studying in each major region of the world. And thinking about the major problems confronting people and emerging concepts of the future and, you know, what is the world going to be like in a post-colonial reality. That's how I got my undergraduate education, and that's what led me to graduate school. I had originally intended to study musicology and applied actually and got admitted to a musicology school, only to find out that it was a history of Western music and that I was more interested in the ethno part of the musicology, and that's what led me in the direction of anthropology. Now, I'm giving you this background because it's relevant to the single point that I'd like to raise this morning. When I first heard about the discussion of decolonizing ethnobotany, ethnobiology, I thought back to the history of the Caribbean and to the decolonization of the world in the post-colonial period, to the emergence of interdependent nation states, and the fact that no matter who you are or where you live today, we're all citizens of some nation in a highly interdependent global network. And it didn't come about by chance. It came about by a very tragic historical process. And it has given rise to the present world system in which we live. Now, that's why it struck me as odd when I heard about decolonizing ethnobiology. I'm thinking of the 20th century as a century of decolonization. No, it was an enlightening experience to have one of my colleagues point out to me that this does not address the issue of ongoing colonization for indigenous peoples around the world. And that for them, the question of colonization is still very much alive and very much real. Now, in my thoughts, I had not intended to overlook that or to ignore that. But I did think of it specifically as an issue that's compounded by the fact that indigenous peoples today are citizens of nation states. And they too are part of an interdependent global world that's organizing itself to meet the major challenges that we face, including issues of biodiversity and climate change and catastrophic warfare scenarios. I don't think I have to harp on this point. We all have been through a rather extraordinary year that I never thought I would live to see. And I wondered, in fact, if we would live through with the same old status quo that we hold dear. I think those of us who realize that democracy is a gift for all people. So having said that, I would like to hear more about how my colleagues view this question of the rights of indigenous people in the context of a world of interdependent nation states, arbitrarily in many cases formed in the post-colonial period, a major post-colonial period, in many cases not set up to address the issues of the rights of indigenous people, which I myself tend to think of as the rights of the ancestral peoples of the world who occupied the world prior to Western expansion and now find themselves decolonized in one sense, and yet part of complex nation states as citizens within which they have to address the issues they face and that all of us face. And in that context, I'm going to end by simply saying I am happy to have been born and to have grown up in Jamaica. It's the best thing that could ever happen to a human being is to have landed in so fortuitous a place as Jamaica. A place where the MC rifle becomes music, the theme becomes, yeah, it's just one love, it's one heart. The goal is very simple. We need respect for human rights. We need social and environmental justice. And we need to be able to get together and feel all right. I've enjoyed that privilege. I would like to see everybody in the world enjoy that privilege. We need to get together and feel all right in support of the dignity of human life, in addressing the problems we face. And at the top of that list is the rights of the ancestral indigenous people of the world. What is our responsibility to deal with that issue through the mediation of our understanding of the decolonization process that gave rise to the making of our present world system? That is the question that I would like to share with you today. Thank you for John for organizing, you and your colleagues for organizing this event, and for Trish for the inspiration, for Wendy, your remarks are precisely what I have in mind when I say these things. I'm glad to see early on many of my colleagues from the Society of Ethnobotany and Ethnobiology with whom I've enjoyed many years of collaboration and discussion of these topics. So I'm happy to see that we're continuing and continuing in a way that brings it to a wider audience.
Great, thank you, Dr. Rashford. Beautifully said. I think we would all agree. Great, and I hope that we will address those questions for sure right off the bat once we join into the panel discussion. For now, let's turn to Dr. Alexis Bunten, Director, Indigeneity for Bioneers Collective Heritage Institute. Dr. Bunten co-directs the Bioneers Indigeneity program and consults in mixed methods research and cross-cultural communications. Her areas of expertise include Indigenous economic development, organizational decolonization, and cross-cultural communications. She'll present a short talk entitled How to Decolonize Ethnobotany, the University as Colonizing Institution, IP, and Indigenous Knowledge. Dr. Bunten.
Thank you. I'm going to screen share now. I was going to just speak on these topics, but then about 20 minutes ago, I decided to make a slideshow. And I'm going to be very ambitious and cover what I would normally cover in about 5 hours. I'm just going to give you some ideas for thought around the topic today. So thank you for inviting me here. I also want to let you know that I am zooming in from the ancestral homeland of the Rumsen Ohlone, which is now Monterey, California. And it's been kind of full circle for me because about 250 years ago, the Russian settlers forced some of my relatives, Unangan relatives, to come all the way down here to take resources and hunt the sea otter. And now I'm here again, where they were a long time ago. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what colonization is and what settler colonization is, because when we talk about these topics, oftentimes I find that people have a lot of different ideas about what it means, particularly with respect to decolonization. There's a really great paper that came out, I want to say in 2011 or 12 by Eve Tuck and Kei-Wei Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And that's because decolonization has been a real buzzword that has been growing quite a bit in academia and just in broader public discourse over the past 10 years. Decolonize your food, decolonize your diet, decolonize your yard, everything can be decolonized now. But in this paper, they argue that the only form of true decolonization is giving the land back, leaving colonized land. So I think of it as one side of a continuum. And on the other side of the continuum is this re-indigenization, learning who you are, learning whose territories you're on. And in between is all of those decolonization as a metaphor. Now, the idea that decolonization is not a metaphor, and when we call for it, that settlers and settler descendants need to literally leave the land and give it back, and there are land movements. There's room for that, but I personally don't find it particularly practical. I'm also descended from European settlers from Northwest Europe, Sweden, and I can't tear myself apart and be in different lands. To me, it's not entirely practical, but there are many different ways to begin decolonization processes. So I'm just going to touch upon a few in this next set of slides here. Here's just a few bullet points around organizational decolonizations that any university or organization can adopt, like doing a land acknowledgement, knowing your local Native communities. And I'm going to say Native throughout this talk, because that's the term I use in my own context here. Don't have a token Native person advise on your project. You will put them in a very bad position. Have multiple people. Always exercise free, prior, and informed consent. And even if you've done research and you have the knowledge and you hold the knowledge, if you're going to use it or deploy it in a way later that the people you originally spoke to aren't going to consent to, you're going to have to ask them again. I ask people again and again and again things, if I can share things they shared with me. We don't talk for anyone else. I don't speak for my tribes. I just speak for myself. Ask for help, but don't overtax Native leadership. People who are willing to reach out and work with researchers and outsiders, they're often the people who are doing all the things in their community, so they get overtaxed easily. Obviously, compensate Native leaders and supporters appropriately for their time. I have a PhD, but it's much less knowledge than an elder would have about the particular place that they live in. So I think they should get compensated $500–600 an hour, and I strive to do that whenever possible. Also, admit when you don't know what you're doing, apologize when you make a mistake. Now I want to turn to showing you four concepts of platforms, because I want to touch upon IP and what we do with the knowledge in this intersection of academia and doing community work and like community-based participatory research or just research in general. The Archive of Healing is kind of a newest archive that came out of UCLA. And it came out of a set of folklore archives that were managed by Dr. Michael Owen Jones, Professor Emeritus in the Old Folklore Department, now World Arts and Cultures. I knew him as a grad student. He's a wonderful guy. And now this is managed by David Shorter. And basically it's a digital archive about healing methods. So what I looked through the archive, and I'm not going to offer any judgment, but I want to share some of the principles that they shared on their website in terms of making this digital repository available to the public. What were the underlying principles that helped to guide the way that they were deploying this knowledge and sharing this knowledge? So I'm just going to read a couple of these bullet points briefly. One is highlighting Indigenous contributions to knowledge. Another one I like a lot is treating the knowledge in the archive as a type of power, and the distribution of power must be inclusive and equal. Should treat health as a social goal with social methods that affirm relationality and kinship, which is very important in our Indigenous communities, which goes along with this next one, providing multiple uses to multiple communities, that the work we do is not just accessible to academics, that it's accessible to everybody who has the need for it. So you can go through and look at that website on your own, but these are just, whenever we're thinking about knowledge, we have to have our underlying set of foundations around it. Another amazing platform that addresses intellectual property issues around Indigenous knowledge is called Makoons. And this is a place for museums, mostly tribal museums and cultural centers, to manage their digital works. And what they've done is provide things like traditional knowledge labels. And these labels acknowledge cultural protocols around the digital object. For example, who is allowed to see an object or work with an object, and at what times. There's a lot of protocols around that. I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with. Community records, having people be able to offer a multiplicity of voices from their own cultural perspectives, stories, and knowledges to the object, not just privileging the academic voice. And round trip is a really cool thing they've built into the platform, which is not losing those labels, protocols, and records when the digital object is downloaded. It always stays attached. This was something that happened when I had a postdoc at UC Berkeley in the anthropology department. The American Anthropological Association was in talks with collaborating with Berkeley to make a huge global archive of just indigenous cultures around the world, information anthropologists had collected. And I loudly objected because of the IP issues, because of the issues that might have been related to how the knowledge was gathered, what were the power conditions under which the knowledge was gathered? Did the people who offered the knowledge, 50, 100, 10 years ago, consent to knowing that this knowledge could be out there for anybody for the grabbing through the internet, 50 years later? It seemed completely and wholly unethical to me. And I just screamed and threw a fit. And thankfully, they did listen to me, and this thing was never made, because it's extremely unethical. And then here I wanted to just bring up the idea of just introduce this into the thinking about science. This was just a comment that I pulled off of a discussion page around Indigenous ancestry on Facebook. And I want to talk about these DNA sites. Now, this particular comment is not particularly, I have no judgment of it. It's neither here nor there. It's just a curious person wanting to know about an ancestor. But I was looking at those DNA sites and thinking about, well, if they had underlying principles to how they're portraying indigeneity and our identity and positionality. And I just kind of came up with a set of assumptions that I believe these companies are working under. And this is what we need to examine, our underlying assumptions when we're working with knowledge cross-culturally. So what I thought these sites had were this idea that science is objective, which it's not, that genes equals identity, that you can break people up into blood quantum percentages, and that's your identity. They use colonizing and very static labels that were applied by scientists that are not the names that the people use for themselves. That's very problematic. They dampen cultural specificity by saying, I mean, obviously their sample sizes aren't large enough to be very specific, and people move and cross spaces and all the, just like John said, so you're not going to get any particular tribe that you narrow down to. And then they also seem to reify this idea of what I call culture with a big C, those identifiable, very obvious, almost shallow markers of culture that are at the tip of the iceberg, things like what we wear, how we dress, how we speak, when really culture goes much deeper than that. So I'm thinking about the commercials you used to see that these companies put out where they would, somebody would find out that they had ancestry in West Africa, and then the next day they're wearing daishikis. That's not how culture works. So this particular chart is an entire hour lecture in itself, interactive lecture, but I wanted to just snapshot it to you, and we can talk more about it in the panel and the questions. I made this chart that kind of compared the way we think about what I prefer to call knowledge gathering or knowledge sharing versus dominant research paradigms. So if you look at this, I already touched on one, this idea that research is objective. Well, we think it's subjective. This idea that research is secular, we think it's ceremony, that researchers and subjects, that you'd even call someone or an animal a subject, that there should be distance so that you can be objective. Well, actually, it's not that case. Relationships are key to the methods. This idea that there's one truth, for example, where we see many different truths. So I can pull this up later if people want to see it more. Here's a list of some indigenous methods, not all, there's no pan-indigenous way of doing research or methodology, but I did see a lot of overlaps with Wendy, with Dr. Geniusz's presentation as well. Things like honoring cycles, things like being able to be flexible, collaborating, renaming. Like I talk about knowledge sharing or knowledge gathering rather than research, giving back, prayer. And I made another chart. I love making charts. This other chart is actual things that I've heard said in cross-cultural research contexts between non-native academics and tribal community members, tribal leaders, tribal academics. People come in and say things like, I'd love to help you, but we didn't ask for your help. I can show you how to fix that problem because I did it in this other place. So that's the idea that actually portends the idea that there's an idea of progress and the Western or dominant way of doing things is better. It's not necessarily, usually isn't for Native communities. I can bring my intern or staff member to do the technical work. Well, why not build capacity in the community and train up a high school student or someone who works for the tribe to do the work? And furthermore, when you bring in your intern and your grad student to do the analysis of something gathered in a community, they have not lived there their whole life and they don't know how to interpret, for example, what the elders might be saying about something. And even if it's in your language, like if it was English to English, I've seen so many mistakes being made because you miss the nuances of knowing the culture. So I'm going to end on these 2 slides. Some good signs that you're doing well in community are here. Things like community members take their time to get to know you. So this is the decolonizing aspect of the research. When people make fun of you, great sign. I gave a talk on allyship a couple of years ago, and a man who'd been working with some communities in the Amazon around biodiversity, he asked me a question. He was all upset because he said that people kept making fun of him there and he felt like maybe he shouldn't go back. And I was like, no, man, they like you. That's good news. Get made fun of. People in your age range or your same sex spend time with you. People call you a relative name or a name of a person who's passed on. People don't complain too much when you pitch in because you do want to volunteer, and there's always going to be a complainer. And when people confide in you, pretty obvious. Some signs that you aren't going about your work too well are things like when there's an overzealous community leader in partnership. So you show up somewhere, you're new, and somebody's like really eager to help you. That's a red flag. Being adopted or taken in or given a name or honorific without having spent the time to properly create relationships. This 3rd bullet is so offensive, and I've heard people say it so many times, it needs to just go away. If you're told you should have babies with somebody or flirted with too much and not respected in your own space, maybe you shouldn't be there. And if you're told that too, you shouldn't be proud of it either. It's a little bit embarrassing. Being given a profound religious experience without doing any work for it, that is to say, making relationships, taking the time to learn, being asked for money or gifts. It's okay to be asked for money or gifts. That's totally fine. But if it's just like too much, too soon without making relationships, and you should offer honoraria and pay people to do the work and figure out ways to do it equitably so it doesn't cause problems in communities. Tribes or tribal leaders not living in their home territory or near it. So a lot of times academics will, or other people doing community-based projects will go into a place and somebody will say they're a leader, but it's actually not their home territory. You'd be surprised how often that happens. And then the last one, getting in dangerous situations. It does happen, and it's probably the worst sign. So I just gave you a lot of food for thought, and maybe something stuck out to you and you'll want to talk about it in the panel. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Bunten, so much. Really appreciate that perspective. We'll move now to, Dr. Catherine Lukhoba and Professor Paul Kamau Mbugua, who are both joining us from Africa today, and we're so thankful that you could join us. Dr. Catherine Lukhoba is Senior Lecturer and Director of Biological Sciences at the University of Nairobi, and she's partnering with Dr. Paul Mbugua today for their talk. Dr. Lukhoba has worked extensively in the Lake Victoria Basin and catchment area in search of medicinal plants and works with local communities to develop their knowledge on medicinal resources for economic development. She was instrumental in starting the Kenya chapter of the Society for Economic Botany and serves as its current vice president. Dr. Mbugua is a professor in plant taxonomy at Kenyatta University. He has grown up and lived among various ethnic groups in Kenya and is the current president of the Society for Economic Botany Kenyan chapter. And together they'll present a short talk covering a number of topics relevant to decolonizing ethnobotany in Africa. Drs. Lukhoba and Mbugua, to you.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. It's really my pleasure to be here and to see people I met quite a number of years ago. John, it's a pleasure to meet you again, and many others that I've seen in the audience. So just a quick introduction of myself. Yes, I am a lecturer at the University of Nairobi, and my work has been a lot on the group labiates, particularly the Plectranthus group of mint plants. But I've also worked a lot in the Lake Victoria region looking for medicinal plants. Sorry, I'm having a bit of light problem. I hope it's going to hold. So one of my area, or one of the things that I feel about decolonization comes from the fact that my country was colonized for a number of years, and my people were very much affected because they had to leave their homeland and move out. So for example, my grandfather actually had to leave the highlands, and he traveled about 300 kilometers away to a place that was drier, much drier, and there were many problems with just adjusting to that new environment. And so one of the things that I note about the colonization effect on Kenya and the Kenyan people is the fact that they lost their food systems, which they were used to. And because of that, you'll probably have read in the news many times that when there is drought, then there is hunger, because the systems of mitigation, the adaptation systems that they had actually fallen apart, and they were basically at risk of all those different activities. So I would like just to share my screen and just take us through a bit of what we thought about colonization and decolonization. I don't know if it's coming on. Yes. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so the question, okay, the definition has been given so ably by the presenters earlier, so I'm not going to that, but I just thought this was good. This particular picture showing one of the fathers of ethnobotany carrying out his investigation, and you can see the people around him, the people giving him the information, those who looked like they were learning, and he himself was respectfully, getting information, which is what we really think about ethnobotany. But the questions that we asked ourselves together with Paul was that or is ethnobotany colonized in Kenya and within the region? How is it colonized, and how can we decolonize ethnobotany? So yes, we agreed that ethnobotany is colonized, and we saw a number of ways that it is colonized, and we identified one as the scope of coverage of our plant study. And one of the things we put our finger on is the curriculum of plant study seems to limit the study of the indigenous plants themselves and sort of emphasize those that have been introduced. So you can see tea, pineapple, coffee, which were introduced, have a lot of space in our study. And those that are indigenous, like these vegetables, solanum, are not really considered. So we saw that as one of the ways that colonization has occurred within ethnobotany, something that maybe we need to work on. And then a second idea here is that during pre-colonization periods, we had traditional practitioners who were able to do many functions. It was basically one doctor who could do everything. He could do surgeries. He could look at the mental conditions. So it was somebody who was able to put together very many modern disciplines as we see them today. But what we see today is that they aren't even allowed to work in that way. And they are probably even viewed as quacks if they do, which is a way of colonizing, because the information they had and the activities they carried were so key, but that is no longer possible for them to do. And then another area is in the nomenclature. Many of the plant names, and of course we know that we do use scientific names to identify our plants, but if we consider that in the culture, those names are not known, they're not understood, and people don't know what to do with them. But we realize that there are so many cultural names because of the cultural diversity. For example, we have 42 different tribes within the country, and they all have names for almost the same plants, but based on where they grow. And that could be a problem. Sorry, back. Negative attitudes to traditional medicine. Now, colonization stigmatized our traditional medicine, and it was equated to witchcraft. Yet we know today that many of the medicines that we are using that are on the market have been extracted from medicinal plants. And this is just a small thing here about the percentage of cancer drugs. For example, I'm very interested in the cancer drugs. About 54% of cancer drugs are from plant origin. So which means that we are losing out as the colonized groups, wherever they are, because we are unable to utilize our resources in that way. And also lined up with that about stigmatization is the fact that new plants were brought as crop plants, and a lot of resources were given. We'll note that when they required land for these plants, the local people had to be shipped out and thrown into, or squeezed into smaller areas, and in that way the indigenous plants lost out in the importance and in the allocation of resources. And then we've also noted that I'll just move on to the next. Where plants that are indigenous have been commercialized, there has been a problem because the products have not actually targeted the local people. I'll give this example of pruners. Much of pruners was exported to France, for prostate drug development, but those drugs could not be used in the local communities where the plants came from because they were too expensive. And then also some of the diseases that the plants had initially been used for in the community were not being targeted by this particular drug. I'll also go to standardization. We have a problem with the standardization of medicinal plants, and maybe that comes in because of the fact that we don't study our indigenous plants and look for ways that we can standardize them so that we take care of issues like shelf life, efficacy of the drugs. I think I'll stop there and I'll allow Paul to continue.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think we'll proceed on to the next slide, and we are asking ourselves, how then do we decolonize ethnobotany? That is the next question. And in the first slide, after that, proceed on, please. We need to popularize the teaching of ethnobotany and utilization of local indigenous plants. Out of about 250,000 existing plant species, only a tiny proportion has been scientifically, we are still on it? Yeah, scientifically researched for bioactivities. Next. Secondly, encourage holistic medicine, interdisciplinary approach, utilization of the local flora, such as forestry, agriculture, horticulture, natural products, anatomy, morphology, and so on. What we are saying here is when people are looking at issues of medicine, they should look at it from a bigger picture, not just the narrow where I'm dealing with only cancer and everything else is thrown through the window. We shouldn't be doing that. We should also kind of bring on board whatever else that we can get from one particular plant. Number 3, we want to widen the scope of coverage to include as many plants from the local flora, indigenize the study of plant taxonomy and ethnobotany, combine what we call participatory and ethnobotanical tools. In other words, we want to bring on board and get the people understand the local flora as much as possible, not just plants from other places and they don't know the names of the plants of where they live, including what we call the indigenous knowledge and the plants and their utilization. Number 4. Let's go on, Catherine.
Okay.
Next slide. Yes, number 4, encourage the use of local and indigenous names. Just like I've said, for example, we have Kiswahili, which is our language in the whole of Eastern Africa. We have other languages. For example, this plant Solana minigram, African nightshade. It's a vegetable that is utilized by virtually all the different ethnic groups in Kenya. And we have the different names. And these names should be popularized so that the local people also get to know what we are talking about in the taxonomy class. Number 5, we are saying change attitudes through ethnobotanical evidence, provide scientific evidence of their efficacy and effectiveness, standardized methodology in case of, so that we can raise the credibility. People don't know how much of this we are using and so on. Let's do some scientific standardization. Number 7, encourage use of traditional foods and lifestyles to reduce what we call nutritional issues. For example, Ansonia digitata, the baobab tree, which is a huge tree, very well utilized by the communities in semi-arid areas in Kenya, in Ukambani and other places. Very important plant. And yet, sometimes it's overlooked when we compare it, for example, to the cypress, because we get more timber with cypress, and yet at Ansonia, though we'll not get timber from it, there are foods and a lot of other products we get from this and very useful to the to the locals. Number 8, commercialization and value add, indigenous foodstuffs and medicines from our local flora. In other words, you are saying, let's not just use them the way they have always been used traditionally. Let's also add value and have other people also come on board. Number 9, Standardization hubs. This one, we took a photograph of some of the people who are working here in Kenya. Next. We are saying, thank you very much for listening to us. We know we are short of time, and so we were two of us. So thank you for active listening, and we look forward to you asking us more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mbugua and Dr. Lukhoba. Wow, I have to say thank all of you. As academics, I am very happily surprised that you all kept within your time. And I was the only one who actually went over in the beginning. So thank you so much for that. And we learned so much just by hearing your diverse perspectives, as we said at the outset, to foster a conversation around this important topic, and really hearing how around the world, the view of what decolonization can mean is very different. So we're going to spend some time now. And for those of you who may have joined since we started the program, if you want to switch to speaker mode, it's in the top right-hand corner under view. And also, if you'd like to join the breakout sessions, which will happen at the end, make sure that you have the current version of Zoom, and we'll give more instructions on that at the end. And also, we are recording everything that you've seen so far, and it will continue to be recorded. And we'll send you all a link to the recording if you'd like to share it with your friends or other people that might be interested. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the panel discussion. So panelists, feel free to unmute or switch back and forth if that makes the most sense. And I'll start with a question that seems to have come up from all the panelists in one way or the other, but maybe it would be nice, and I would say all of these answers as we go through the panel, if you can, full, complete answers, but concise if possible, so because we only have about 35 minutes for this portion of the event, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. But I'd love to hear if each of you had a perspective on what decolonizing ethnobotany means to you and for you in your particular study. And we'll start with Dr. Geniusz.
In my work, decolonizing ethnobotany really is trying to work together and to really be community-led. I think that there's a lot of work that botanists and ethnobotanists can do with Indigenous communities, but I think that Dr. Bunten's points about, going and saying, I want to help you, there's an issue there, right? You really, if you're approached. But that said, I mean, if you are on a project and you are working with a community, some of the things that come to mind for me are when we're working on decolonizing in our communities, a lot of that is trying to revitalize this knowledge. When we're talking about Canada and the US, a lot of that is trying to revitalize that knowledge within our cultures, trying to bring it back to the kids, trying to bring it back to the youth, because we've been really hit by the forces of colonization, and we haven't had a chance to do some of these things before. And in that context, the world has changed perhaps a lot, right? Since our ancestors worked with these plants. There are now a lot of pollutants and environmental contaminants, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff out there. What comes to mind, one thing is our cattails. They suck up anything. Well, a lot of plants suck up anything, but cattails, they're using those to suck up nuclear waste. I mean, there's some issues there if you're going to touch some of those, right? So I feel that if you're on a project with a community and you're working on a revitalization of botanical knowledge, that really, if you know that there's some contaminants in an area, or if you can do research on what's been in this area that people are going to go and gather botanical materials in, that would be a great resource you could bring. Another one would be that there are certainly dangers with working with some botanical materials, and if a group hasn't worked with those materials in a long time, that part of the knowledge may be gone. It's really hard to teach generation after generation how to do something if you haven't had access to it. So, if you know of certain dangers in using too much of a certain item, or if there's certain poisons that people are overlooking in an item, that would be a really wonderful contribution that you could bring. I think I'll leave it there because I want to hear from my other panelists too. But I think there is a lot we can do together. We just have to come from the right mindset, this positive mutual mindset, and really what are our strengths we can contribute.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bunten, this seems to maybe intersect with some of the work that you're even currently doing that you speak about, so maybe you'd like to also provide your perspective.
Well, I'm not an ethnobotanist, but I worked on IP issues and issues around place-based knowledge, and I do a lot of consulting in this area, and I think I hit on a lot of the points, and I'm obviously going to overlap with what many of our panelists have to say, but I would start with, no, sorry, my dog is doing something bad. I would start with thinking about dismantling existing power relations and hierarchies. Start from the decolonizing, because colonization is an ongoing structure that not only works to oppress peoples, but it also is, many of us think of colonization as an ongoing process that that seeks to eliminate indigeneity, whether that's your body or who you are or your knowledge. So dismantling power relations, which requires learning, educating yourself about how to do that. There's lots of materials coming out about how to be a good ally and make relationships. And I realized that in my very quick 10 or 15 minutes, I probably could have said some things that were a little intimidating, but I want to encourage everybody in this audience that, meet those local community members, learn how to make a relationship. I'm sorry, my dogs are here. Get out. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
I'm almost done here with that point. They were just standing there at the door whining. Anyway, I would say I'm not trying to scare you off. Make those relationships. What I found is that community members, elders, knowledge bearers, tribal leaders are often very, very happy to work with academics. We understand that we each hold unique talents and gifts and knowledges that we can share with each other. And it can be really, really positive all the way around. And just to, provide opportunities for mutual growth. Support local community members in maybe being able to get compensated to stay in their ancestral territory and work with their traditional knowledge and their plants. Bring in volunteer crews from the outside to help with cleanup and restoration. There's all kinds of really, really great ways that you can decolonize the field while doing great work, building great relationships, and probably at the end of the day, learning a lot more than you would have had you followed traditional academic methodology.
Great, thank you so much. And I see in the chat, someone says, meaningful relationships take a long time to develop. So obviously there's some investment that would be involved with that. Dr. Rashford, I wonder your perspective on decolonizing ethnobotany, which I imagine might take a historical perspective as well.
Yes, I tend to look at it historically. But I also, I'm very much aware of the particular circumstances of the Caribbean. I too was trained as an anthropologist, and I know that anthropologists have gone through this debate, from the founding of anthropology and the Enlightenment and the justification for expansion and colonization, and the early development of American anthropology against the use of ideas for racist and exploitative purposes, the need to broaden the scope of anthropology by finally beginning to take into account questions about peasants. The Caribbean doesn't enter into anthropology thinking until the 50s and 60s. And then it enters under the guise of, labor and the like. I mention that background only to say that for me, decolonization, all the things I hear are very important. And from the perspective of sharing ideas, I would like to see the ethnobiological sciences use their perspective to address the historical context of what we're talking about. I don't see very many articles published in our scientific journals that deal with the history of ethnobiology, for example, or ethnobotany, and put it in that context. And I think there needs to be some discussion about the role of the ethnobiological sciences with respect to national interests. I think there's a lot that we can do at a national level to benefit the community of citizens that are represented by national states, including indigenous people. I think there is, a link in modern ethnobiological sciences and indigenous people that is worthy of being explored as it was by anthropologists at the turn of the century up until the 1930s. Many indigenous people wonder if in fact it is their lot in life to be the subject of anthropologists. There are a lot of cartoons of anthropologists, people running and hiding and taking off their glasses and, hiding their TV and so on to meet the stereotypes of anthropologists. What I'm saying is I personally don't live in that world. I think the history of botany, economic botany, ethnobiology, ethnobotany is in fact the history of the making of our modern world. The Caribbean was born out of that history. Its plants and the need for a labor force that produced that history. And I know many of us in the Caribbean deal with this issue about terms of reference, how people are referred to in the literature, and how their historical circumstances are described. So from my point of view this morning, I support everything I've heard as far as, the things we need to be thinking about and addressing in our thinking and in our work and in our conversations. And I'm glad that we're able to have this discussion. But I hope in the future of ethnobotany and ethnobiology generally, we can make more room for a really deep and genuine appreciation of how our modern world has come into being, what it has meant for all people, not just those who are traditional people of specific places, but those who have moved around in the trafficking of people for labor. And I don't just mean the people of Africa. I mean also the indentured servants that came from Europe and were brought to the Caribbean, the people from East Indies that became the source of labor for the British Empire in the 19th century, moved to Asia, moved to the Caribbean, moved to South America. I mean the people today who are migrating all over in search of a meaningful way of life. I think ethnobotany has to be, from my point of view, universal. It really has to deal with the human condition and be able to provide insight that we can all draw from in meeting the challenges that we face. Because clearly, it is not a single community challenge. It is not a challenge to us as minorities or blacks or white. This is a human rights issue. This is a global issue. This is an issue of environment that does not represent national boundaries. But most of all, it's also an issue of the indigenous people of the world. And I don't want to overlook that. And I'm glad for the opportunity to hear voices that represent and defend that particular point of view.
Great, thank you, Dr. Rashford, so much for that historical perspective. I wonder if Dr. Mbugua and Dr. Lukhoba, but Dr. Mbugua first, if you might have some perspective from Africa on some of the things that Dr. Rashford just said about this historical perspective that might be a bit different from your particular situated knowledge.
Yes, Dr. John. Thank you. Yes, we have had something parallel to the Caribbean, yes, especially when we are talking about colonization. But as we were discussing this topic, we were also viewing it from the perspective that when you go to study plants and there are plants you are not very familiar with, you definitely become an outsider. Doesn't matter whether it is the same country or it is the same language you have. but the people who have the knowledge are a different ethnic group. And that's why I'm very interested in what Dr. John is talking about from an anthropological point of view, because that also brings out the aspect that to get to the bottom, we have to get to the relationships, which of course sometimes we overlook when it comes to science, because sometimes in science, just like I think is somebody else who was presenting and was saying there is a slight difference. I think it's Alexis, yes, Bunten. You're talking about there being the difference between what we call research from the Western perspective and research from the indigenous people. Because the indigenous people, this is already something they have, they already know. They are only telling it to you because you're an outsider. And what we were saying is that at the end of the day, we have to remember that this knowledge is not just the way I understand, it is also understood from the perspective of the giver. The one who is giving you the information, they already have the methodology, they know what goes on, they know how much and so on in terms of quantities, in terms of qualities, in terms of seasons. So there are quite many dimensions which we may not be able to capture when we are studying something in a straight line, as it were. But when we look at it from a holistic point of view, then we are able to compartmentalize and probably be able to understand it better. So the whole question of decolonization, we are not just talking about ownership. No, it's more than that. We are talking about understanding. We are talking about utilization. We are talking about where you are taking it. And we're actually even talking about the future. It's not just now. So decolonization is a whole long process. And I like the continuum that was given, that it is starting somewhere, yes, that you may not be very sure where, and is going somewhere else. In other words, it's a whole discussion which we need to undergo and agree and keep talking to one another. Because the question of colonization, that is administrative. Those are small things as far as I'm concerned. They are events, and they come and go. And the long term, what is the long term? What is it we are dealing with? And those are the perspectives that personally I would like to see brought out a bit more. I think Catherine may have something to add.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Lukhoba, if you'd like to add.
Okay, thank you. Yes, when I think of decolonization, I think a lot about the community and the fact that for many of them, they don't have other options. They have to use these very plants or their natural resources for their day-to-day lives. That's how they survive. And so because they depend on it so much, then we really need to safeguard that resource for them. And one of the ways I see is to actually use ethnobotany as a way of building trust between researchers and the users, so that we, I'm considering myself as a researcher at this point, so that we can be able to impart the knowledge of how to conserve. And if we can make friends and good relationship at that point, they'll be able to trust us with the information that we give them and be able then to sustain their environment. I'm just thinking of our Nobel Prize winner, Professor Wangari Maathai, who really advocated for planting trees, and she went all over the country doing that. And one of the things she said is that if you plant a tree, you are actually safeguarding the human rights of that individual. Because if you cut the tree, you dehumanize the individual so much that they really they don't see themselves in the light where they have the rights, and that is a terrible thing. So our plan and how our people live is so interrelated that we have no option but to continue this decolonization to the point where every human being has that dignity and feels happy with their environment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there anyone, I'll give a chance to other panels to respond to anything that was said. If not, we'll shift gears just slightly. Okay, great. I just want to pick up on something that came up in a couple of the talks, particularly in Paul and Catherine's talk, but also I know that Wendy, in particular, Dr. Geniusz, has worked on issues around taxonomy and nomenclature. And I wonder if, you know, words matter and names are important, and we hear that again and again. How might taxonomic systems be connected to colonizing forces, and what role do they play in decolonizing efforts for you? And this is for Dr. Geniusz, but we could open it up to everyone afterwards.
I want to show you something. I struggle with this a lot. You're going to see why. Look, see, in our indigenous languages, we have a different taxonomic system, a different way of naming things, right? And our connections between species and our groupings they're way different often than non-native science. And here's just some examples. And you're going to see the irony here is that I have the non-native scientific names too, right? So first of all, it starts with, this is Name, right? Now you'd imagine that Name would be related to a Dikame, right? And a Namegos and Manamego. That kind of makes sense. This doesn't make as much sense when you're looking at it from a non-native perspective. Name Beneganj, Gitchen Namewashk, Namewashkuns, right? So Name, right, the sturgeon, and you can go see some at these places. This being is in our taxonomic system related to members of the mint family in non-native taxonomies. So there's so much stuff in our languages, and there's so much in our names of these plants and all species on Earth. On the other hand, when you're writing about this, or for my work, I'm really working with communities who are trying to bring this knowledge back. Like, it's really nice to be with panelists in places where people are relying on this knowledge, because that's not where I'm living and working right now. You know, we're really trying to bring it back. So for that work, if you're gathering knowledge, you're a community member working with elders, being able to make an exact identification of what you're talking about is really important. And my mom and my namesake, who taught me this knowledge first, like, they really stressed you got to have the scientific names of the plants too, so we can go back and recover what you were doing. So I struggle with it so much. I was in a panel this summer. I said I would never be on a panel again after that experience, and the person I was with was like, Latin is the universal language. And I'm like, well, no, it's not to me. You know, she didn't let me jump in, but it's not. So it bothers me thinking that we have to have the Latin names too. So I go back and forth on it. But I guess if you're doing the kind of work I'm doing, where you're really trying to recover stuff to bring it back to the communities, you might need those identifications too. And if you're someone who's really great at non-native scientific identification, that might be a big contribution that we have with collecting these names, and we got to be able to connect them to the right species. So I go like this on it. But
thank you, Dr. Geniusz. I think that, well, first off, thank you for joining another panel after that experience that seems less than ideal. And I hope that this rectifies that just a bit. So Dr. Rashford, I wonder if you've maybe had similar experiences in your work traveling around the world with taxonomy and understanding the indigenous perspective through nomenclature itself.
I would say everywhere I've been, this issue arises, not just in relationship to plants, but to the whole colonial tradition of naming things. And we know how important it is to claim things by naming and renaming them. This is not an unfamiliar topic to us. And it's a devastating thing to have your landscape and your cultural points of reference renamed to suit other people's convenience. But such is the insidious nature of the colonial past that we're talking about. And the right for people to reclaim the way they name the world, and for us to take it seriously in our scientific work not by giving up the very purpose for which Linnaeus came up with a system of scientific names, but for thinking seriously about the tradition of using scientific names for vanity. If we're going to use scientific names, it's time we start using them to honor the people we study and whose plants and culture these things represent. But doing away with scientific name, I'm not quite sure is in our interest, given that, as far as I'm concerned, my interest in ethnobiology is the sciences. And I also recognize that the link between science and colonialism is not arbitrary. When I was a student at CUNY, Eric Wolf wrote his very famous book on Europe and the People Without History. Now, a lot of people misunderstood it because they thought he meant people didn't have history, but he was saying we treat people as if they have no history. And it was interesting that, you know, a lot of colleagues did not agree with that. They did not want to have that intruded on their perspective of studying traditional people as the hallmark of anthropology. To them, the making of our modern world was something outside of the legitimate framework for ethnobiological concern. So I agree with the fundamental importance of language. The most celebrated person in Jamaica is Louise Bennett. She's the person that redeemed our language for ourselves. When I was growing up, it was a sign of your ignorance and backwardness to speak in your native language. When I took my language exam at CUNY, I took it in Jamaican because the linguists at the time said it's a separate language, and they brought tapes for me to play and books for me to read. I could have taken it in other languages, but I took it in Jamaican. That's what it says on my transcript. So I appreciate the point that Wendy's making. It's a very important point, whether we're talking about the presence or removal of statues, the naming and renaming of sacred mountains, and all of these other uses of icons that for some people is reinforcing of who they are, but for many other people is denigrating. And the ambiguity of the use of symbols and names and so on is something that, as ethnobiologists, we have to take seriously. If in fact we intend ethnobiology to represent the dignity of human beings and to work on behalf and promoting that dignity in the interest of a unified community. You know, I really believe strongly that whether we're ethnobiologists or from Jamaica or from Africa or from Europe or wherever we're from, that the future of the world is really in our common hands and in our shared destiny. And I don't have any doubts about that. When I see young people rising up and accusing us of being totally irrelevant when it comes to addressing climate change, I can't help but feel, to a certain extent, they're right. And it bothers me to know that that's the case. So, Wendy, I appreciate the comments you're making. I agree wholeheartedly. And people who change their names, who rename the environment, you know, I understand that. But I also understand that it is problematic. Should we be spending our time renaming all the plants and animals in nature with respect to the Linnaeus system? Probably not. But should we acknowledge that from hereafter, it might be a bit of redemptive act and decolonization to name things in the natural world that honor the people and their history and tradition? I think that might be quite appropriate.
Great, thank you, Dr. Rashford. I wonder, Dr. Bunten, if, you know, as a practitioner and someone who teaches in many different places to diverse audiences, what might be your take on this, the effort around this, whether it's renaming or taking down statues or reclaiming and decolonizing?
Well, what came up for me is linguistic relativity, which is the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis that came out in sociolinguistics, I want to say around 1945 or so. And this is the idea that our language and what we speak shapes our worldviews. So, and this is just kind of bouncing off what Wendy and John said. if we, I would say a yes, I would take a yes and perspective, which they were both saying, or that's what I heard. When it is important to be cross-culturally conversant and learn multiple languages and different ways of thinking. And the more we can expand our brains by learning from other indigenous and other classificatory systems, the stretchier our brains will be, and the more we'll be able to understand the natures of the ecosystems and the plants and the animals and the other forces that shape them. And one advantage of indigenous language and classification systems, which Wendy so wonderfully showed us, is that you begin to understand the interrelatedness of the natural world in ways that the dominant Western paradigm doesn't allow us to see. So it really opens up a lot more doors if we yes and it.
Great, thank you. Dr. Lukhoba, if you're still there, and Dr. Mbugua, I do see you. Yeah, I welcome your perspectives as well.
Okay, maybe I'll go first.
Sure.
Yes.
The nomenclature or the naming of plants is very key. I'll give an example. We have a plant, it's called Catha edulis, and it grows mainly in the highlands, Mount Kenya highlands. But according to the traditional taxonomy, it has about 3 or 4 names, actually even from almost the same community from around the mountain. So on one end of the mountain, they call it one thing, and just around the corner, it's a different thing. So we decided to look at all the versions, all the samples that had been named differently. And taxonomically speaking, they were exactly the same, but according to the community, they are different. And they, because Catha edulis is chewed, the leaves are chewed, so they would tell us that they actually had different tastes and they had different effects also. So I think we need to keep those indigenous names because they have something, there is something they observe that we can't as scientific community, and we really can't, we can't put our finger on it, and therefore we would lose out. But for them, they actually have different uses. And what is interesting now is that there is one version of it, that is being used to make wine now, yet another can't be used to make wine. So there is knowledge in the traditional names that we really need to take care of. If we don't understand it scientifically, maybe we should be able to document it within the community. Thank you.
It's a fascinating story. Dr. Mbugua, would you like to add?
Yeah, yes, and I had similar examples of some of the crop plants, like the yams. We have also done some studies where we do have Diascorea as one of the genera that some of our students have done some studies. And you go to the communities and you'll find, yes, scientifically you are calling it the same, but there are varieties and there are differences. And so when we do the ethnobotany of whatever they are using and how they are using it, very, very different, very different. But on the books, we are calling it basically the same. And therefore, at the end of the day, we have to utilize and adopt the knowledge from the community so that we can give the specific differences between the plants themselves and how the people are utilizing them. So our job we have as ethnobotanists is documentation, and also to find out what are the people calling them and why are they calling them the same. Because if you look at them only from the point of view of taxonomy in terms of names, it's not good enough. In other words, our science still has gaps and we need to go a bit deeper. However, I also wanted to point out, Dr. John, that when it comes to the names, I agree that using the binary system and sticking to only that system, you may lose a number of things. However, at the end of the day, if you want what we call the universality of science, and you want other people also to read your paper and understand it, it is important that we have a system that we can actually defend from the perspective of science, and it's just not just in the fluid names, as it were. Because when you do that, at the end of the day, you'll have somebody come down the years, about 4, 5, maybe 40 years down the line, and they would know which plants they were talking about. So the standardization base, I read of somebody else who had written that the rose plant by any other name is still the rose plant. So even if you give it a number, or you give it a number, I mean not a symbol or any other identity, it will still remains the rose. And it's true. But then what is that label? What is that identity that it should have? That's where we have, of course, the taxonomy coming in, and the naming and the authors' names. And that's why we insist on that when it comes to taxonomy, and for some of us who practice taxonomy. I know and I agree, as the panelists have also stated, it is sometimes very unknowing when you have a common plant that you are used to. Tomorrow it has another name, and then after that another. Yeah, I know it can be very annoying. But remember, when if we want to really standardize our science, we also have to have a criteria, and it has to be universal. We have to agree about it, as many of us as possible, so that we have a common way of communication. Because the bottom line is, what is it you said 15 years ago? Was it the same plant? Was it the same species? How many branches did it have? What are the shapes of the leaves? What about the hairs on the other side of the leaf? Those kind of standardizations are very critical when it comes to the proper identity of a plant, so that you can know what you talk about 15 years down the line. I know that it causes quite a bit of discomfort, especially to non-taxonomists, but we do appreciate the fact that we also need to have a standardization of sorts, so that we can be able to communicate and be able to standardize the science we are talking about, and the species, the specific one, the variety, the subspecies, and so on, the various taxa that we talk about. Thank you. Sorry, I'm taking you to my side of taxonomy only.
No, I have to say, as a botanist, and many of the botanists here must be, I'm feeling the excitement. This is, I think, such a, it's a synthesis of what we want to talk about with decolonizing the ethnobotany and the anthropology aspects. I think it's really important. I do want to have the audience start to consider your own questions. We're at the point in the program where we want to open it up to audience questions, but I also want to give Dr. Rashford a chance to respond if you would like to. But before I do that, I'll just say, submit your questions either in the chat, I'll be monitoring there, or you can virtually raise your hand by going to the bottom right under reactions. If you click on that, there's a place where you can raise your hand and I can see that, and then I can unmute you and you can ask a question directly to the panel. So keep that in mind, but Dr. Rashford, I don't know if you wanted to respond, but please feel free to.
Well, I would just like to say, I'm supportive of the whole discussion, and I understand the point that Paul is making and Catherine, and I clearly am supportive of that. And I think I would also like to add, however, I think ethnobotanists have an important role to play at a national level in all of these concerns. I think playing a role in the development of national policies that are going to be affecting landscape and biodiversity, and even the role of indigenous people, I don't think we can escape this obligation of working in a globally interdependent world. And I think that the discipline is going to have to come to terms with the making of our modern world system, where it is going, how it is affecting all people, most of all, the indigenous peoples of the world, and what is our responsibility to them, to the environment, to the climate, and to ourselves in moving forward. Certainly naming and how we name things is part of it. And it's not just a matter of ethnicity, it's a matter of gender. I remember Julia Morton, who had worked in the Caribbean, complained to me one time about the the idea about woman's tongue and mother-in-law's tongue, which she thought was offensive. And at the time, I was so naive and ignorant, I couldn't even see the point. I take it you all know the plant that they call woman's tongue. I mean,
it is called Sansevieria laurenti.
That one I think is generally known by the name mother-in-law's tongue.
Yes, mother-in-law's tongue. That
Yeah.
was my PhD thesis.
Albizia is a woman's tongue. But you know,
Yes.
I'm just pointing to you that, you know, we have a lot of those kinds of names, you know, back for
Yes.
this and, you know, Governor Mango and, you know, all kinds of imperial titles. Also titles that are ethnic stereotypes as well.
Yes.
And the question is, do we continue these things because they're tradition born of colonization at a time when it was okay to be insulting to people and the like. So even if it's our own, even if it's local, I say in the greater cause of human dignity and in the long run, because I would like to get together and feel all right, let's do away with it.
Okay.
I would just add one other thing. You know, I don't share the view that culture belongs to each of us according to where we're born and our ethnic background. I just don't. As far as I'm concerned, culture belongs to all of us. And I thank all the people in the world for having come up with something that all of us can share in and participate in and learn from and benefiting from. This is not a forward-looking pie in the sky view. We all are eating corn, we all are eating mangoes, we all are eating breadfruits, we all are eating sugarcane, pineapples. You know, our diet is already globalized. Our sense of ourselves. And so I would like to see ethnobotany step up to the challenge of history, knowing it, applying it, understanding its radical potential, and step up to the challenge of making ethnobotany relevant to all of us worldwide, including the people of Europe, including the people wherever they are, who are part of the journey of our species and part of the journey of where we are on planet Earth. That's really my hope, that all of us have inherited human culture. We all have a right to it. I don't know of anyone who denies other people the right. Everywhere I've been, people are flattered to know you're interested in their way of life. They're flattered to know you want to learn their music and that you enjoy their food. They're not hiding it from you. They're not telling you this is mine and you're not entitled to it. We're already living a globalized life. And, you know, I would like to see us do it consciously with the recognition that it is one of the great benefits of globalization that we are all in a position to claim our rightful inheritance of human beings, which is a right to learn and to accept what is good and what is best from everyone, wherever it comes from.
I think that's very well said. And I imagine that Drs. Bunten and Geniusz might have a response to that. Now, I'll complicate things a little because, as you mentioned, that many cultures may be accepting to want to know how their culture is celebrated. But of course, there's the other side of that, which is how it may be taken advantage of. So, and we have some protocols, for instance, that have been discussed and brought about to help protect some of that knowledge. For instance, the Nagoya Protocol and the Convention on Biodiversity, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, Food and Agriculture. And those are some ways that I think the international community has sought to protect the encroachment or the a more capitalist vision of how culture might be taken from one place and utilized in another. So, and of course, there's this emerging perspective now on the DSI issue, the digital sequence information issue, which is the real cutting edge of how Nagoya might be applied around the world. And I wonder if we can integrate a little of that into this conversation of how you see the Nagoya Protocol, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Plant Treaty, and others playing a role to protect the information when we cross that boundary, and how we can use it proactively. Anyone can jump in, but I know Drs. Bunten and Geniusz haven't spoken in a bit.
I'll jump in, unless you would rather go first, Dr. Geniusz. Okay. Well, all of this conversation brings to mind, there was a time when I was working with Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and we had some people were very knowledgeable about plant medicine there. And once a year, a group of doctors from around the country would come and they would take a tour with this elder. And she'd walk 15 feet and talk for 3 hours. And at least an hour of it was dedicated just to the plant that we call the Devil's Club. And I'm just pulling together a few threads, but in the clinical language, you know, there isn't just one word for the plant. There's words for different, like even the stem, there's like multiple different words for it. And it's pretty well known that parts of the, I haven't had this plant in a long time, but parts of the leaves, I can't remember, are good for treating like colds and things like that and have certain medicinal properties. But the roots, if you prepare them a certain way, they're hallucinogenic and used for medicine in a different way. And that's kind of what's widely known. But if you were to go on this tour with this elder, you'd find out that there's about, you know, like 50 very specific different medicinal uses for different parts of the plant. And even one particular part, you can prepare it this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, or this way, and it'll address different things going on in the body. And so without that knowledge, then you know, without that language to know that knowledge, you'd be missing out on so much. But the funny part is, and this is why I was saying language equals thought, is that these doctors, the elder was speaking English and I was just supposed to drive them there. Like I just drove them in a bus to the plant and stood by to help the elder. I was on elder standby to support her. And I was translating English to English. And it was a crazy, mind-blowing experience. And I think it's because these doctors were so steeped in their particular way of thinking about medicine, they couldn't even understand English because it was not a way that they were used to thinking about plants. And so that's why I encourage people to try and learn to think cross-culturally where these languages can help. And then secondarily, and I know other people will get into the IP and ethics and laws, I know a number of years ago, some of the Native organizations up in that region of Southeast Alaska, they did get together and make a concerted decision not to commercialize this plant. And so that's not been happening. And so we need to have people who hold that knowledge to have the power to determine how that knowledge is going to be disseminated. And my third point is, since we have a lot of very knowledgeable people in the room, people who've studied for years, I'm sure, is that it does take a whole lifetime to learn that. I don't know how long it took that elder, and I'm just not saying her name to protect her identity because I didn't ask her permission to tell the story, and I'm only telling it from my perspective, but how many years and hours did it take to learn that? I can't even imagine, even if you're an ethnobotanist or someone who studies this stuff, you have to spend a lot of time in place to learn these things. So I almost feel like some of the more nuanced knowledge, it's just the amount of time it takes would be a gatekeeper to that information getting out or being misused.
Great, thank you. Dr. Geniusz, did you have something you'd like to add?
I hadn't thought about amount of knowledge being a gatekeeper. That's interesting. I think what comes to my mind, you know, of course, in the States, the tribes are sovereign nations, and since the 1970s, I mean, they've had review boards that researchers have to go through. So there's a whole lot of protecting knowledge and protecting research on, you know, on the reserves on those nations themselves. So it's quite a politically charged conversation to talk about who has the right to, you know, learn this and who doesn't. And in our cultures, and I guess I can speak better from the perspective of Ojibwe culture, but, you know, because the plants are so tied to ceremonies, and because there's so many dangerous botanical things out there, right? The more advanced knowledge comes after going through multiple levels of our, one of our religions is called the Mbugua. So you go through multiple levels of that before you even get to that really, really advanced knowledge, being able to work with those potentially harmful beings. So where this knowledge, in communities where this knowledge is still around, you know, there is quite the investment in time, and, you know, traditionally that wasn't given until that level. So it's a really, there's a lot of issues we've brought up here, but it's been a nice conversation.
Great, thank you so much. And we did cut short the audience questions, but I'll remind everyone we'll have the breakout sessions. So to Tabitha and Tara and Tanika, who have put questions in the chat, if we don't get to them, please stay on for the chat session. You can ask those as well. Laura Roberts Nkumra, I see that you've raised your hand, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. And if you would like to, oops, I might have muted you. Yeah, go ahead. You can ask your question to the panel.
Hi, John. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the members of the panel. My concern is not so much as a botanist, but primarily as somebody in food. I come from a part of the world, the Caribbean, which, like so many other colonized parts of the world, have an issue with food security. In the Caribbean, more than 90% of our food is imported. And much of that comes from species which are not native to our part of the world. However, we do have a number of native species that have been entirely overlooked or very little addressed by our research. And I know a lot of it has also to do with stigmatization, which was part of the colonization process. Even when we imported plants or species from some parts of the world, let's say breadfruit, which is one that I have worked on, one would find that a crop like that, a crop species like that, that has such great potential for food, there has been quite a bit of stigmatization that has hindered its development and utilization in the region. And so the irony is that in a part of the world where we have growing conditions year-round, we have this travesty of food insecurity, primarily in the Caribbean, probably more than anywhere else in the Caribbean, Latin American area. From the point of view of decolonization, I wouldn't join the discussion too much about nomenclature. I would leave that for the taxonomists, except to say that even in taxonomy, we find that no nomenclature is set. It changes all the time. And so I do not know why it is one would necessarily want to hold steadfastly to any one system. But be that as it may, my concern is from the viewpoint of decolonization, it would seem to me that education is a huge part of how we see plant species and the potential in any and every plant species and the need for education about them. So that even I would think in our form of education where we have been so specific, we are in the science or somebody is in the arts or in the in environment. Those are issues that to me prevent the transfer of knowledge and particularly the access to knowledge in different ways, what we regard as scientific, what we regard as true knowledge, and it really hinders our appreciation of the value of plant species or anything else that come from other cultures except those of the colonizers. So that, I don't know, I know John is from his discussion very optimistic and so on, but I would really like to address this issue or to hear a response on this issue of the education that needs to go into how we think about plants, how we think about food, how we think about cultures, how we think about peoples. Because as long as we have this power, this power play, that power issue, which is so much a part of colonization, then it shapes people's thinking, and you can literally have people starving in an environment in which they ought to have plenty. So I will just stop here for now. And as I said, my key issue is food and nutrition security and the impact of that colonization process on it, and how decolonization, the approaches that can be used, particularly in education, to addressing that issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Let me just say we're almost at time. We only have a minute, so I would say that we can definitely take this conversation into the breakout session. So perhaps if you'd like to join Dr. Rashford's breakout session, that the conversation continue. But with a minute or two, would anyone like to respond to that question and comment?
I think can I input something here?
Sure.
I think the whole question of this kind of bias, and we have had it here in Kenya, particularly towards what we call the local vegetables, the wild vegetables that we collect from our gardens when you are clearing the gardens and weeds. And the attitude had been that they are not that useful, they are not that nutritious. And a change of policy has had a great, tremendous impact, such that now in Kenya, you can go to some of the supermarkets and find our local indigenous vegetables, some of the people buying and having them in the supermarket. And this has shifted the whole idea of cabbages and kales. And in other words, the cabbage family is no longer the dominant vegetable in Kenya. And I think this can go for many other types of foods. And I'm sure even for cereals, if you're talking of the root crops and so on, it's possible to change. However, I agree with Laura that it needs a whole shift of thinking and the attitude that people have always held, and the leadership. That's why you bring them on board together with the taxonomies, as we are saying, the botanists, the ethnobotanists, all of them to come together and agree this is the way this nation goes. And as far as nutrition is concerned, these are our sources. We are going to popularize them. We are going to put papers for this. We are going to fund this for the research and finally get it out to the people. Otherwise, you continue having people looking down on your local vegetation, the local sources of foods for the people, and that doesn't help much. You continue with the same problem. And I think that's also what we addressed in one of the points that we raised in our presentation, where we are talking about the attitude and also the change of culture, food approach, and other uses of plants, because some of them, since they are local, people look down upon them. And you'd rather have imported food rather than growing your own, although they are in small quantities, but sometimes more nutritious and more available to the members. Let me stop there, John. I think
great.
we're running short of time.
Thank you so much. Like I said, the enthusiasm and the excitement, I think, is really important. And I'm so glad that from what I've seen in this panel, I think we can all be excited that we were able to come together and reach some consensus on a couple topics, but really hear the diversity of thought around it. We are going to break into breakout sessions now, but I want to thank everyone on the panel. If you can give your virtual reactions, if you want to give applause to everyone. But I want to thank everyone. This was so wonderful, and I really appreciate all of your time and the planning that it took to do this. So I'm going to put a link for www.econbot.org into the chat. That is the Society for Economic Botany's website. Please consider joining the society, especially as we prepare for our summer program, which will have lots more discussion around this topic and others. And then we'll also have another event in the fall. And I mentioned at the beginning that there's a student event as well that's also listed on the website happening on May 6th. So there's a number of exciting things happening over the summer. Even though we may have to be physically distant, we can still keep the intellectual debate going.